Well, Sidhan Sibal, the Indian Prime Minister did also mention that I look forward to reviewing all aspects of bilateral cooperation with my friend, President Vladimir Putin, and sharing perspectives on various regional and global issues. When you talk about global issues, there are some who will say that since Russia has been isolated by the West may not really favor this trip by the Indian Prime Minister to Russia. What do you think?
Well, essentially, India is doing a balancing act now. Essentially, when it comes to this visit is coinciding with a crucial summit in Washington. Now, we know the NATO summit happens in Washington, but here in Moscow, the leader of the world's largest democracy is present alongside Putin. And we know that West, of course, has been trying to isolate Russia, but Russia sees India and many of its Asian partners as key allies at a time it needs their support. In fact, Russia's economic development is being lauded by the World Bank, and that is primarily because of increased import of Russian crude oil, Russian energy by countries like India. So India has stood with Russia at a time of its need, at a time when it's facing isolation from the West. But all in all, this careful balancing by New Delhi is something that India has to do for its own people. India, of course, is now a country which has the largest population, and India wants cheap energy, and that is something that India is trying to tell to the West that yes, of course, there is a Western pressure, but can the West fulfill India's issues regarding cheap energy? Only Russia has been able to do so.
All right, Sidhan Sibal is our principal diplomatic correspondent. He is in Moscow, and the Indian Prime Minister has already touched down in Moscow. He's about to meet the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Russian President will host the Indian Prime Minister for a state dinner. And then tomorrow, the Indian Prime Minister is set to meet the Indian diaspora living in Russia. Sidhan Sibal, you had a chance to speak to some of the Russians and some of the Indian diaspora in Russia. And yesterday you did speak to the Indian ambassador in Russia. What are they expecting from this trip from their Prime Minister?
Well, everyone has their own set of expectations. You talk to diaspora, they have their own challenges, and of course they see, of course, Russia as a second home. In fact, just a short while ago, I spoke to Abhay Singh. He is a Bihar-born person who is a Russian national, but he's an MLA here in Russia from Kursk. He's the only India-born MLA in the entire country, and he belongs to Russian President Vladimir Putin's party. So he, of course, sees himself as a symbol of India-Russia relationship. So as I said, everyone has their own story when it comes to India-Russia relationship, and the expectations vary in various degrees. Now, when it comes to the payments crisis, that is something that pinches many students because they need to carry cash. In fact, it was a problem for us as well because cards do not work here because Russia is facing sanctions. So we need to carry cash to come to Russia and pay for everything. And that is something that can be difficult for many where card has been the norm across. So that is something that is a problem facing them. Now, second, of course, issue is when it comes to the Indians in the Russian army. And that has been a big issue in India. And we know India has raised that with the Russian side several times. In fact, just last week, the Indian External Affairs Minister spoke to his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Astana on the sidelines of the SCO summit, and that was raised directly. There could be announcements, especially opening up of new Indian consulates. Right now, of course, India has 3 diplomatic missions. First, of course, embassy here in Moscow. Then, of course, consulate in St. Petersburg and Vladivostok. But there could be announcement on 2 more consulates. There could be announcements in defense sector as well. And of course, something that everyone is closely watching is the body language, how the Indian Prime Minister will be welcomed by the Russian President, especially for the private dinner later today, is something that will be closely watched. The pictures, of course, will be closely awaited.
Well, something interesting is that they say that the relationship between Russians and Indians Indians goes beyond the people-to-people relationship, because it is said that Russians love Indian food. You've been there for one day. What has been your experience?
Well, of course, there is, of course, a past, a very glorious past between India and Russia, and many still remember Raj Kapoor, a famous star, a movie star in India, and fondly remember him. I spoke to many of the diaspora, and they, of course, talked about it. In fact, the cultural show behind me, if you can see, if my camera person can show, there are, of course, Indians right now, but there were Russians as well who were making some dance moves here as well. And there is a group, Hare Krishna group as well, assembled to welcome the Prime Minister. So essentially there is a strong cultural link between both India and Russia. Indian food is quite famous. You can easily find a Indian restaurant here in Moscow. And focus, of course, is to increase that people-to-people relationship. Many people remain nostalgic still about the Russian or the Soviet support during the Bangladesh Liberation War. The Friendship Pact that was signed is something that is much talked about even till today. And then, of course, the famous visit of the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to India and to Srinagar as well. And the Soviet support to India when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir is well known. So there are several aspects to the Russian support in the past. And of course, the Russians have been helping not just in terms of the cultural exchange, but also in terms of technology. Space is something that has been an example of it, whether it is Gaganyaan or whether it is helping send an Indian to the space 40 years ago is something that is still talked about. So I can in fact speak about India-Russia relationship for next 1 hour, but that shows that how substantive India-Russia relationship has been. I can talk about the UNSC, of course. Russia has been a consistent supporter of India at the United Nations Security Council. It, of course, has been calling for Indian inclusion in the UNSC, and it has been a Russian veto that in the past has come in support of India whenever Pakistan has been trying to raise Kashmir. So that has been the international dimension of India-Russia relationship.
That is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidhan Sibol, live in Moscow, Russia, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Moscow for his two-nation visit to Russia and Austria. Among the Prime Minister's engagements in Moscow will be an interaction with the Indian community, which is scheduled for tomorrow. You are watching WION Wild as One. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.